My name is Julie Arnheim. I am the co-chair of the Road of Sholem Biblical Botanical Garden, and I'm honored tonight to introduce Greg Siegle. Greg is a professor of psychiatry and psychology and translational sciences with the University of Pittsburgh. One of his major focuses as a researcher is neuroscience of mental health. And he also has his own healing garden at home. And here at Rodolph, we are honored to have him as part of our musical leadership team. Greg, I welcome you. I believe there will be time for Q&A towards the end.
Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you all for having me tonight. This is such an honor and such a great opportunity to speak about this topic. I've been personally inspired by gardens for so long, and every person I know who has a garden tells me how healing it is, how awesome it is for them to spend time in their garden. And I just have started to think about why. What are they getting out of it? And sort of the hammer that I have is neuroscience, so I figured let's apply that to the nail that is gardens and see what we get. Turns out people have done a whole bunch of research on it, and that's what I'll tell you about today. I have a bunch of slides. I don't care if I get through them. Rather, I would really love to hear from you. Feel free to ask questions at any time during my talk. And if you're on Zoom, maybe somebody in the back can actually hear it, or if you put it in the chat, somebody will read out questions from the chat. I would love to know what's inspiring you to know more about with gardens. That said, let me start by just asking folks here, what do you love about gardens? The things you find most restorative. People use that word a lot in the gardening literature. It's restorative somehow. It breeds positive emotion. What about gardens does that for you? Julie? Resiliency. Right. So the actual metaphor of the plant and what we read into the plant becomes part of our personal narrative. And if the plant can come back after a hardy winter every year, so can we. And we come into the garden, and one of the things that you'll see that I'm going to mention later is what gardens trigger in us is activity in a brain area called the hippocampus, which gets at our episodic memories. And it actually pushes us to remember things and to augment our own personal narrative. So yeah, absolutely. Yes. So, right. So the actual visual aesthetic, and particularly the colors, is something that is so critical for people. And it turns out they've done the research, and differentiation in hue. You need lots of hue, lots of variation in hue for a garden to be perceived as positive. You make it all green, and people don't perceive that same garden as positive. So yes, absolutely. And it turns out actually it needs to be shifted toward the green-yellow spectrum. If it's more toward the blue-purple spectrum, people don't find that same garden as positive. But yes, that is one thing that they found in everything from laboratories on down. Gary. Yes. So Gary's saying that there is this element of discovery. You're walking along and you find something you have never seen before, and that's just glorious. And it does a very interesting thing for our brains, especially those of us who are prone to looping and who get in holes of negative thinking over and over again. Some novelty pops us out of that. That discovery is actually what takes us from being inside ourselves, going over, yeah, this world is exactly the same as it was yesterday in this negative way that will always go on that way, and say, wait a minute, I just saw this flower for the first time here. There's something novel, and you can make meaning of it. And so what we find, and one of the things I will emphasize, and I'm just sort of presaging more of the pictures that I show you later, is that when you are in a garden, you don't have to work as hard to regulate emotions, because so much of the information coming in from the garden is doing that work for you. So the prefrontal mechanisms that are usually sitting around in our brain, working so hard to keep our emotions in check, they can shut off because the garden is absorbing that function. And that's part of this discovery. Anything else that people love about gardens that we want to put on the board? Yes. Yeah, so okay, so what you've said is one thing that's important about gardens is you can bring other people in, and it makes it social. And I actually want to start there. This notion that gardens are not just a unitary phenomenon. And here's why I want to start there. I'm a mental health researcher. And if I want to research mental health, the old way was give people some drug, which has its problems. They have side effects, they can be costly, or give people individual psychotherapy, which is not accessible for everyone, and it takes a lot of effort. There are some things that I would like to have in an intervention for mental health, if I could, that would be important. It should be easy to find and available. It should be pleasant. A lot of psychotherapies work, right? And people don't do it. Do you know the number of visits to psychotherapists, the modal number of visits people have to a given psychotherapist? It's one. People go one time and they're like, yeah, too much, and they're out. It's because it's not fun, right? So I'd want it to be fun. You want it to often be free or very low cost, low effort, low resource requirements to get there. You want it to be not stigmatizing. People leave therapy a lot because they feel it's very stigmatizing, similarly for drugs. And then you want it to be something where you can actually involve the people in your life, your dog or your partner or your friends. We are social animals. It turns out that loneliness is one of the biggest causes of mental health problems. So we would imagine that combating loneliness is going to be part of the solution. If I can have an intervention that combats loneliness, that allows for some social, it's going to work better, right? And gardens do that. So if gardens are positive for mental health, they satisfy all of these criteria, and they'd be what I want. So now it's up to the evidence. Can we go look for it and say, are gardens actually positive for mental health in some way? And I'm going to contrast all of these features that are present with gardens to the interventions for mental health that we normally talk about, psychotherapy and medications and transcranial magnetic stimulation on down. Does it have these variables that gardens do? All right, so what is the evidence? I want to talk about just the evidence that time spent outdoors amidst plants and water features is actually health positive. And there's a book that if you're interested in this stuff, I will absolutely call your attention to. It was transformative for me. It came out just 2 years ago during pandemic, called Wildness and Wellbeing, Nature, Neuroscience, and Urban Design by Zoe Myers. It's accessible and it's incredibly well referenced. And where Zoe Myers starts out is saying gardens, well, contrasting cities and urban environments to gardens. And this is important because not everybody can necessarily find big, long paths in the woods, but you can put a garden inside cities and transform cities from vulnerable spaces, which are often health negative in some ways, into what Zoe Myers calls a neuropolis. And I'll tell you what that means in a second. So there's lots of evidence that urban living and urban environments are stressful. The congestion and density alone, especially with COVID, the habitat loss, the economic disparities that make up cities, yield increased disease for people who live in cities versus more rural environments. Urbanicity, just the fact of being in a city, has so many sensory stressors. I don't know how many of you have tried to drive in Israel. My experience was learning to drive stick shift in Israel, where as soon as you get to a hill and the light turns, everybody just starts beeping, and everybody behind you is beeping, and then you don't know how to shift the car and you go backwards and it's a mess. And that was, for me, Jerusalem. Cities are inherent risks for anxiety and depression. Living in a city actually increases your risk for anxiety by like 20% and depression by 40%. Compared to rural environments. This is incredibly important because more of the world is shifting to cities. I have this statistic: by 2050, 70% of the global population is going to be in cities. So if we want to do something to combat urbanicity, it's probably going to be, what can we do to change the environment or make it so you can change the environment? And gardens would be part of that solution if they help. Fitzgerald is actually the one who coined the term neuropolis as an environment that enables healthy neurological functioning in its citizens and thereby a space that fosters individual and collective flourishing. So gardens are places you can go and you can feel like you're flourishing. It almost doesn't matter who you are. You can have Alzheimer's and appreciate a garden. You can be in a wheelchair and appreciate a garden. You can be from a destitute background and appreciate a garden. They are equal opportunity, flourishing environments. And because they are not geared at individual intervention, but there are things for people to come to, they become a public health response to a vulnerability. That's very vogue right now. We're starting to work in mental health on shifting from individual interventions to what can we do as a society to capitalize on, for example, neurodiversity and help people as a society to be able to navigate the society better. Gardens could be part of that solution. Again, if they work. So what's the evidence that they work? Well, the evidence they work: exposure to nature versus urban environments is psychologically beneficial, associated with increased mental health, renewal or recovery of resources or capacities that have become depleted in meeting the demands of everyday life. Turns out that if you have more nature near where you live, they've done these plots, they do these heat maps of cities. I think it's Andreas Meyer-Lindenberg actually done these beautiful heat plants of where you live in a city and how much depression and mental health issues you have. And the people in the city center where there's no green space have lots of it, and as you get farther from the city center toward where there's more green space, you actually have decreased levels of depression and mental health issues. As you spend more time outdoors, it's decreasing distress. We think because it's stimulating attention and cognitive processing and decreasing the use of brain resources that create fatigue. That is to say, to live in a city, you're exposed to so many things coming at you all the time, and you need to get on the subway at just this time and navigate all the people packing in. So much stress as you get cognitive fatigue just existing. By the time in New York that I get off my train ride to get to the office building where I sometimes work, I'm actually tired. I go into the workday tired. Outdoors, I don't feel that way. And so for years, there have been these nature-based interventions for mental health. And I'll mention some of them later, but a lot of them just involve walking around in a garden or walking around outdoors. 30 minutes outdoors improves mood in a garden. And that's a statistic that I'll come back to sort of over and over today. It's not just mental health, it's physical health too. It turns out that if you look at how long it takes people to recover from surgery, if their window in the hospital faces green space, they actually recover from their surgeries more quickly and they end up needing less pain medication. The only difference, they looked at actual hospitals, which windows looked at urban things, which windows looked at green spaces, faster recovery, less pain medication if you had a window on green space. So this is evidence that this nature stuff actually helps, right? So at least in my world, when you get evidence that something helps in the real world, we want to take it into a lab in a controlled environment and say, can we reproduce these effects in a lab and make them go in a super controlled environment? So we've actually done this, not my group, but other groups, and it turns out it works. So they show people nature images or urban images. And these aren't bad urban images. They're not like people stabbing each other or something. They're just buildings. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have begun with a content warning and just say, I talk really frankly about mental health things. I'm going to mention depression, anxiety, and PTSD. If that's something you don't want to hear about, take the time you need. If you need to walk out of this talk at any time, I'm okay with that, or shut your Zoom or something. In any case, compared to urban images, nature images were viewed by people as being more restorative. People liked them more. They felt they increased their connection to nature. That's sort of new from duh for me. But they also had more easily recognized objects. The city pictures, people didn't know what to make of them. This, if you can't tell, is a streetcar, but it took me a while. This, I can know every element in this picture really quickly. So it's easy. Nature's got some easy to it, and it's positive. So it turns out you have people walk in nature for almost an hour, and reliably, their mood increases. But it's not just their mood right then. If you then have them do cognitive tests right afterward, they do better on cognitive tests that you're given right after you walk in nature compared to if I have you walk in a city. That to me was pretty incredible, right? Because I can actually manipulate what you're doing. You're walking the same speed, the same amount, and they actually had people do the same amount of walking and just change the environment, and it changes how well you can think. Turns out, doesn't stop at how well you can think, but what you think about. If we have you view nature, your aspirations, what you want out of life, go from extrinsic things, I want the corner office, to intrinsic things, I want to be happy. So being in nature shifts your goals to things that you can actually affect, internal goals. Doesn't stop there. It turns out that it affects basic emotions too. One day of walking in nature yields decreased hostility and depression compared to a control day where they assign people, today you're going to walk this much in nature versus walk anywhere else. And when people are done walking in nature, they feel more lively than on the control day. You would think, oh, well, if I'm walking in nature up hills and stuff, I get tired and all that. That is not the result. You actually have more energy coming out for the time you've invested walking in nature. So if you say, oh, it's a day where I'm too tired, no, you'll be less tired once you're done. And then again, as I said, it's not just mental. Viewing nature increases pain tolerance in the lab. So we do pain inductions where I actually do things that would make you hurt, like usually we use thermal pain, put a hot thing on your arm and it's painful, and you can tolerate more pain if you're looking at nature versus if you're not. All this says to me, nature's good. It's good for us. We're built for it. Makes sense, right? We were evolved to live in nature. You take us out of that environment, and we might not do as well as the thing we were evolved to live in. Don't have evidence for that. I do have evidence for what gardens do to the brain, though. And that's what I'm going to tell you. I love this picture because just looking at it from a distance, you don't know whether it's of a brain or a garden. In any case, they put people in brain scanners. I do a lot with brain scanners, MRIs. And the way we do this is we take 2 MRIs very quickly, and we look at what's different between them. And in one MRI, you're sitting there staring off in space. In the next MRI, I show you a picture of a garden, and I subtract them, and I see what's different. And there are these minute differences. If I do that many times with many people, I can say what in the brain's activity was different between gardens and not gardens. And so I can actually look through the whole brain and see where the differences in the MRI was. And that's basically, it's an index of blood flow. And it turns out that when I do a stress task, that is to say, I make you, in this task, in this paper, they had people subtracting 7s from 213 repeatedly, and you have to start over every time you get one wrong. And we tell you you're not going fast enough. It's a very stressful task. And what people get is a lot of activity in this area of the brain, which is the amygdala. It's our fear center, and it recognizes things as threatening. But you have less of that activity if you live in a rural area than a city area. You say, oh, but city people should be good at math, and they should be doing things fast, and should be able to process lots of information. Again, not so much. It's the rural folks who have less stress on this task. So then they did another experiment where they brought people, or they gave people pictures of nature spaces which were wide open versus indoor, narrow spaces. And it turns out you have increased visual processing in the wide open spaces. You might, again, not think this intuitively. The narrow spaces have all details you should be looking at. No, you give people wide open spaces and their brain engages. They become active. They're seeing what's out there. In our urban environments, we might not even see what's out there. Our visual cortex is not as active inside as it is outside. If any of you have pets, I can tell you my cat comes alive when I take the cat out into the garden compared to in the house. And all of a sudden, she's processing all of the information, and her tail's going and her eyes are going. That's what I'm talking about. Now, we say gardens increase mood, right? You have emotional gain from green space exposure. Turns out the more emotional you get from the green space exposure, the less activity you have in your brain in the emotion regulatory areas when I show you fearful faces. So fearful faces are usually stressful. They're things that make me upset. If I see somebody's fearful, I have to look around, where's the threat that made them afraid? And so evolutionarily, it makes me on edge. And then I have to regulate my emotions if I don't want to flip out at people. Well, it turns out that if I've been green spaced exposed and I'm getting positive benefit from it, then I don't do as much emotion regulation later. And this is, again, what you potentially goes to what you were saying about social functions. I get less anxious about social exposure in these outdoor environments. And also just this idea that we can work less hard outside than inside because the garden's taking up our emotion regulatory function. It occurred particularly in those who spend lots of time in green spaces. That is, with people who didn't live in the city center, where there was also psychiatric illness being increased. So more time spent in green spaces, probably better for these gains. Make sense? Okay. So what is it? So we've said nature's good. What is it about nature that's helping? One possibility is that it's the plants. It's something about plants. We're hardwired for it. So they did this experiment and published it in the Journal of Horticultural Science, where they showed people control images or plant images, and those prefrontal regulatory mechanisms that have to regulate your emotion, they can shut down some. They don't have to work so hard if you're just looking at plants. Looking at plants was associated, you might say, oh, well, they're not regulated. Did they become dysregulated? No, looking at plants was judged as more comfortable, more natural, and it relaxed people more. So they were more comfortable, they felt more natural, they were more relaxed, and yet less emotion regulation because they just didn't have to regulate. Life was good if you're looking at plants. So you say, is pictures of plants enough? Well, pictures of plants helps. We showed you that with the scanner experiments. But then a group that I think is in Japan actually did the work of showing people plants on a monitor or actual plants and showed that this brain activity change actually is bigger when you see the actual plants versus the pictures of plants. So you want to be out in gardens, in actual gardens. So are gardens special over natural landscapes? I'm going to say actually even yes there. So we got that it was nature, we got that it was specifically plants, that it was specifically real plants, and now how about gardens? Are they special? And it turns out they are. This group that I believe is in China actually did landscaped gardens, and these are Chinese gardens, versus natural landscapes. And they also did low definition versions to say, we think that it's the big wide features rather than the tiny little details. And what they showed was compared to natural landscapes, there are a lot of brain areas that activate specifically for gardens. I'm just going to walk you through them because it's an interesting collection. The first area, as I mentioned, is these visual processing areas. You get a garden, and all of a sudden the brain is turning on. It turns out they've done the work and found that it's these simplified elements. In a natural environment, there's so much to look at. Whereas in a garden, it's planned, it's intentional, and so your attention is being guided and your visual cortex knows what to do with that information, so it can be really engaged and it's easy. Again, a message I keep giving, gardens feel like they're hitting the easy button for our brains. Turns out the hippocampus is also engaged, and this is what Gary mentioned with this sort of narrative that we get from gardens, right? And this is our memory structure. So the memory structures of the brain become active when we see gardens over natural landscapes. We tell ourselves stories, maybe about, or maybe what Julie was saying, you know, about the cycle of life and thinking about our own life or something like that. Similarly, the cuneus is active, and that's an area that does a lot of self-processing and linguistic processing, so we're talking to ourselves more with gardens. We're telling ourselves stories. All of that to say, the magic of gardens, is it magic? In my book, it's neuroscience. We can say the brain becomes engaged in specific ways I would expect are health positive when people view gardens even over natural landscapes. It's not just seeing gardens. And pretty much the rest of what I say for a while is going to be about this multisensory phenomenon that gardens are. Hearing gardens and hearing nature, also important. Turns out listening to cities is less pleasant for people than listening to nature. Again, not something that I feel is surprising for most people probably, but as a collection of evidence, interesting, right? Get out in a place where you actually hear birds, it's good for you. Listening to nature facilitates healing, multiple experiments. And in my group, we actually took this to a fairly strong extreme and took depressed people with borderline personality disorder who were in an intensive outpatient program and played them bird sounds. And you think this is crazy, right? How could this possibly help? Listening to nature and saying, attend to each bird. And we said, now listen to the crow. Now listen to the seagull, and learning to direct your attention to elements of nature increased their ability to pay attention to things. And it decreased their rumination and their depressive symptoms. So we had a little computer interface where I could just click to birds versus tapping sounds or voices. And each day they did this. Their depression went down, their self-reported rumination about negative things went down. Each day they did this intervention. We imaged the brain, and their amygdala activity went down. They actually had to regulate more to do that, so prefrontal control went up. The coolest part of this was that we followed up with how much they used the hospital a year later after this intervention with the bird sounds. And the people who'd done our bird sounds intervention used the hospital less than the people who were just getting good therapy and good medications, but no bird sounds. And here they were getting therapy, medications, and bird sounds. So I was actually really blown away by this. I think that hearing nature is important. Turns out that it's not just hearing nature, touching nature is actually important too. Somebody asked, is it normative that I walk in a garden, like I go to Phipps and I touch all the things? And it turns out it's probably good for you. It increases brain signatures of relaxation when you're sitting there touching a plant. 30 minutes of actually gardening outside is known to decrease depression and increases mood. And this is across all sorts of diverse groups of people, including older adults. So you say, should you get older adults into gardening? It might be hard for them and all this stuff. It actually helps, and it's health positive. There is speculation, and this was more speculation than an experiment, that direct contact with soil and plant microbes might actually help your microbiome. You're getting something physically from touching the plant. So brains like touching gardens. So multisensory, we've got the visual part, we've got the auditory part, we've got the touch piece. I want to hit on the visual part a little more and say, what are the big visual elements specifically of beautiful gardens that we're going to look at? Because a lot of people are often ask me, what can I do different after these kinds of talks? So maybe we can give, so if you want a health positive garden, how do I make it be that way? The first place I looked was a literature that I'm just fascinated by because I'm a religious sort. And it turns out awe is a really interesting concept. We talk a lot about God and having awe of God. Awe is a profound and positive emotion. It stimulates a sense of well-being and health. A sense of time is plentiful. When you have awe, you feel like you've got all the time in the world, and curiosity and interest. It turns out that nature can stimulate awe, but it's not all nature. Nature does lead to more awe, works better for awe actually than profound personal experiences if you take somebody out into nature. Turns out it has to be big nature. Gardens have to be bigger than you see in big garden elements, big water features, mountains in the background, things like that, all really help. Vistas. There's a garden in Encinitas, a meditation garden in Encinitas, California, which overlooks the ocean, known to be extraordinarily gorgeous. If you go to the Tulip gardens in Amsterdam, what's amazing about them is they seem to go on forever. And there's just this sense of awe, seeing these colorful landscapes that go on as far as the eye can see. If you can create a sense of space, seeing something bigger than us, Dr. Keltner has done a lot of this work, seems to introduce this feeling of awe. At least having them big enough to walk in helps. 30 minutes of walking in nature seems to be the restorative number, though 5 minutes of exposure seems to do pretty well. But if you can get a garden that's more like a community garden, lots of people, or something like the biblical garden back here at Rodef, that's the kind of thing where people can walk around and get these restorative experiences. 60 minutes seems to be the number for people with mental health issues, including depression, that decreases depression. So get out and walk for an hour. It turns out gardens with multiple environments actually show changes in brain function related to increased engagement and reduced frustration. So if you want your garden to be something that's constantly engaging and decreasing mental signatures of frustration, have different elements. Like in the garden back here, we have our little pond area, we have our biblical plants area, and then we have our plants that have biblical names but aren't themselves biblical plants area. And it's sort of segmented into sections. If you go to botanical gardens, they frequently segment into sections. So you come, and this is what Gary was talking about with this sort of spirit of discovery, right? Where you can come up on something and say, wow, that's new for me, that's interesting. Or if you go to FIPS, the different rooms that they have, that's where you're going to get these big changes in brain function that say your brain's always moving and you don't have to be doing regulation because you're constantly being wowed by the next element. They did this work, by the way, wearing portable EEG systems. So they put electroencephalography systems on people's head and had them walk through gardens with changing versus not changing elements, which I actually loved. And they saw when the elements changed, that's when frustration got reduced and brain signatures of frustration got reduced. Water features, there's actually a big literature. There are a bunch of people who got interested in neuroscience of water features. I'm not going to go much into it tonight, but it turns out specifically that green trails that are along a canal reduce cortisol, which is the brain's stress hormone. So if you want stress reducing features, water features are really good for that. Visual characteristics that help. Perceived naturalness if you're going to make quick judgments. If you're going to make slower judgments, if you're going to sit and look for a while, that's where these intentional gardens really come into play. So as I was saying, these immaculately sculpted tulip gardens or Japanese gardens where when I went to Japan, the gardens in Japan, they had guys out there trimming one leaf at a time to make the most beautiful possible garden environment. And I was just amazed. He would trim a leaf and then he'd step back and look. He'd go, and here's one more leaf he has to take off over here, and nod and yup and move on. And it was that level of intentionality. That's important if people are going to make slow judgments. If you're just making quick judgments and something people look at on their way, then you want a more natural looking garden. Having some regularities in color and visual structure are helping preference and positive emotion, speculation. It's improving memory and cognitive function as well. Regularities being the lines of tulips in a tulip garden, or the spice gardens, which are, moving in sculpted ways. As I mentioned before, more yellow-green content rather than blue-purple content. I am not talking about getting rid of your blue false indigos as much as ratios. And then diversity also in saturation. So some not as saturated areas, some more saturated areas. I want to talk about one final element, and this will be the last part of what I talk about and then open it up for questions. And that is to say, this is a spice garden, by the way. If you haven't seen spice gardens, they're gorgeous, amazing. I recommend planting one. Gardens can be filled with stuff you can eat. And we talked about the multisensory nature of gardens. Putting stuff in your mouth from a garden, nothing like it. This year I've got fennel. I planted it last year and it was this high, and this year it's over my head, and it's the most amazing stuff to pick off a stalk. But I digress. This is my garden at home, and it's filled with vegetables and healing things. So gardens have so much we can eat, from vegetables, flowers. I plant nasturtiums, which you can eat, and so many herbs. It turns out that a lot of the herbs that you use, from basil and oregano out to cumin and turmeric, spices that we use, are often antibiotic, often immune boosting. I'll tell you what I have in my garden at home are things that make people happier and calmer. So I grow St. John's wort, which is effectively the original SSRI, the original Prozac. It's the same mechanisms. Lemon balm, it's an antiviral. Turns out that it's a GABA agonist, which is what we use in a lot of mood stabilizers. Bee balm I grow, which is an antibacterial agent, really good if you're feeling a little sick. Mugwort, anti-anxiolytic, has monoterpenes, maybe also serotonergic actions. Another thing people in, I think, Japan do with mugwort, though, is they stuff it into little puppets and they make fidget toys, and it helps ADHD to play with mugwort toys. I grow yarrow, and yarrow actually helps pain, has flavonoids, which are anti-nociceptive or anti-pain. And it's good for gut things because it's an astringent. I grow mint, which is an anti-inflammatory. Near as we could tell, more and more literature is saying depression is an inflammatory disorder, and you can take anti-inflammatory agents and it reduces depression. If you take aspirin, it actually, or Tylenol or ibuprofen, it reduces your rejection sensitivity. So if you're going to be fired, take some Tylenol that day. Or mint, just chew on mint. Catnip, turns out it's not just for cats anymore. Cats get high, we don't get high, but it is a little bit sedative for us. And then fennel reduces menstrual cramps, by reducing the effect of prostaglandin, which actually creates the cramping. And then we had a request to mention that people often get scared of what's in their garden, and foraging can be a thing. You don't have to be scared. There are so many ways to not be scared. You can plant things intentionally, but then there are these apps, and I'm going to recommend apps like iNaturalist these days, where you can just point it at something in your garden and say, what is it? And it'll tell you. And then you look it up and say, is this one edible? And we do a lot of playing with, is this one edible in my house? And it turns out a lot of what's in our gardens, a lot of the volunteer things that are weeds, or that were once thought of as weeds, turns out they're Pennsylvania native things that people brought in once as food, and we just don't normally use it as food anymore. I do a lot of harvesting of dandelions. I love dandelions. My garlic mustard is a weed that people rep out as invasive. I love that stuff. It makes great pestos. And could go on and on about all the things that we're ripping out as weeds or don't even think to eat. Did you want to add anything to this? What? No. Did you want to add anything?
There are so many plants, as you were saying, that have been brought here from Europe that are now native. I have found at least 4 different species just on between my neighbor's house and mine that were herbal medicines. They still are if you use herbal. Just pretty interesting.
Yeah. So much out there. I recommend it's a beautiful rabbit hole to get into if you care about it. And anybody who I know who has started looking at it is finding all sorts of stuff around their house, and their house becomes a garden they didn't know it was. I want to, just because of where we are, mention ancient gardens for a moment. Of course, Eden had lots of stuff growing. They talked a lot about the fruit trees. It turns out Jerusalem, back in the day, had great gardens outside. Trees, especially palms, especially citron or etrog, and they had vegetables. Turns out you didn't actually have a lot of gardens in the interior of Jerusalem that were vegetable gardens and trees. And the reason was because you couldn't bring in manure, which was the fertilizer. So it was gardens, on the inside were flowers, mostly rose gardens. So if you think of Erev Shel Shoshanim, the Night of Roses, the roses actually played a big role in ancient Jerusalem. You could have them inside Jerusalem. When I started looking at what was in the gardens in Jerusalem, likely they were like those of the Egyptians, which turns out we know a lot about from excavation. And the Egyptians grew garden vegetables, herbs, spices, onions, leeks, cucumbers, lettuce, fennel, coriander, cumin, all that stuff. There's a nice website on it in liverpoolmuseums.org in the UK, which if you ever want to see what was in those gardens, they've done beautiful work excavating and figuring out what was being grown there. And it turns out these things were not inert. So citron or etrog contributed pretty smells, that multi-sensory stuff I was talking about, right? Roses are aromatic. petals, it turns out, you can eat rose petals, in case you didn't know. If you want to be the modern-day Ozzy Osbourne of gardens, you just bite the head off a rose. And it's anti-anxiolytic. Most herbs and spices, as I said, are antibiotic. Many have some psychoactive effects that you can look up, recommend it. This is just a little chart saying that most of these things in different doses can be stimulants or sedatives. And play around. I've had no end of fun going on the web and seeing. So, where are we left? I wouldn't be a responsible scientist if I didn't say there are some cautions. There are risks, and I'm not saying that gardens are for everybody. I'm not saying that you should just imagine gardens will always be of benefit. People with sensory processing issues, exposing them to places with a whole lot of color all of a sudden, you might want to think about it, prepare folks, or see how people react. There's a lot of thought about accessibility. Amsterdam has talked a lot, actually, about how they don't want to make gardens just for the rich, right? How do we make gardens something people can all go to, not just have my private garden that's beautiful, but plant gardens in places where people might not expect them or might not otherwise be able to access them, the deepest inner cities. If you've ever tried to walk through Central Park in New York at night, you know that there are fears for safety in gardens that people have, and some people just have these negative associations in the big gardens and know that, and we can start to address it. And then there's also a literature on people feeling unwelcome in garden spaces. Especially, there is a prevailing view, gardens are for rich white people who have just that kind of hat. And if you don't have that kind of hat and you're not a rich white person, do you really belong in one of these fancy botanical gardens? We could be doing work to combat that, and some places are, but it's actually going to take our work to say we want to invite people in. And maybe when we make our posters about the garden, not everybody should look the same. And maybe when we have our talks, we should advertise that these are talks. And one thing Julie said to me when I was preparing this talk is, this is not just about Jewish gardens. You have to make this something that is accessible for anybody who wants to listen, because that's what we want. Also, we're not sure about the dosing. We've got this notion that 5 hours a week at 1 hour visits is really good for depression. We haven't done the dose response experiments. And we found that people get some benefit from 10 minutes a week. So maybe that's enough. We should be doing that work. We haven't yet. So I'm telling you what has worked. I'm not telling you what's the minimum dosage that people could get benefit from. Consider privilege. That's in every talk I give these days. We have to come back to how privileged we are to be able to take advantage of all of these technologies and all the things we talk about, that I talk about anyway. The most economically deprived areas are still the most green deprived areas. And when we talk about the benefits of gardens, realizing not everybody does have access to them. When we think of public health interventions, it's going to mean putting gardens where they aren't yet. And then not overpromising. There's a discussion of gardens that they are healthy, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're healing for all things. And just because you visit a garden, you shouldn't expect, well, now I can get up out of my wheelchair. And nature isn't automatically positive. Think we were in the desert for 40 years as Jews, and nobody's saying, hey, that was really a health positive experience for us in certain ways. So we could think, what about nature makes it positive, and emphasize those elements. With that, some things to consider. I've talked to you now for 45 minutes. How does this all change our relationships to gardens? Would we do anything different now that we've heard this? Would we plant something different, create differently? What else do we need to know to make informed choices to make all of this information useful? I'd take your questions or your speculations on these now. I'd love to hear from you, and thank you very much.
Online? Are there any questions online?
And you
No.
can put them in the chat if you want to.
No questions
Yeah.
at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a great night. Thank you very much. And I have a lot of questions. So, one of the things like, intentional, I guess like I attend some before we were in I'm open mind. So,
Actually, yeah, can we pass? And if you're comfortable, please feel free to say your name.
Wessel.
Wessel, huh?
Thank
Okay.
you. And so, one question I have is that, I don't know if I use the term correctly, right? So, has the, well, we say, working garden, working farm, working in nature to help with depression, with other mental illnesses, adapting more clinical symptoms, or is that more supplements that's really the issue?
Okay, so what I can say is most of the people doing this work where they look at reductions in depression, these are reductions in depressive symptomatology. They're not looking for cures, and they are not doing randomized controlled trials where they take people off all their medications and say, if you just have gardens, do you get better? So it's usually samples of people, whoever is coming in who is depressed, do gardens help in addition to whatever is going on? What? Yeah, so there are protocols where they incorporate outdoor elements into treatments. And I have a couple of references. Yeah, there are a few studies where they have incorporated gardens specifically into treatment regimes for mental health. But yeah, so, and they've been basically positive.
Yeah, because one of the things that you mentioned is how people are planning to plant a garden because sometimes you kind of come up with the housing design, the original housing, you tear down some of the structure and you
Yes, yes. So this is an extraordinary question, right? If I have a chance to make affordable housing or I have a chance to plant a garden, what should I do? And places like the High Line in New York got in a lot of trouble for this, where the city spent a whole lot of money making a pretty garden-laden area where they could have been making affordable housing better. And the High Line was a poignant example because you had a whole lot of very dilapidated public housing right around this pretty garden way that they built. So yeah, it's all things to balance. Again, I would look to Amsterdam as a model for this because they've really tried to say, what does it mean to integrate green space into city planning and do these things in conjunction? Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Please. Right. Okay, so how beneficial are houseplants? So a lot of these studies that I mentioned actually have been done with seeing individual plants, and like this one in particular showing just looking at plants actually changes brain function, and being around foliage plants, increases relaxation. So I'm going to say there's some benefit. How much long term with people, I don't know. I don't know that literature. And in terms of cats and dogs, what I can say is this. If you are sitting around worrying about the potential toxicity of your plant all the time, it's going to increase your anxiety more than it's going to decrease it. So it may be an interaction between the actual potential toxicity and how much you're worrying about it with your cats and dogs. The other thing I can say is you can walk into most garden centers and ask, what plants do you have that are not toxic for my cat or my dog? And at least Sorgel's up north is really good about knowing that stuff, but a lot of garden centers have people who know that. Yeah. Yes. Right, right. So it's an interesting question. If we are outside, so those who don't know, during the summer, we sometimes go outside and actually have our services in the garden. This is a complex issue. There's actually commentary in the Talmud about how you should not stop praying because you have stopped to look at nature. You should continue your prayer. So, the visual distractions where it may be positive other times, how that interacts with prayer, unclear. So then you get to this question of noise. If you can't hear the prayer because of some element of the outside environment, all of our commentators would then say, you don't want that. That said, we have this person who's sitting right in the back here, named Luke, who by the end of last summer had our outdoor sound system humming, or not humming, but making the sounds we wanted it to, in such glorious ways that I stopped concentrating on the outside sounds and was actually able to hear the prayers and the music. And so I felt like by the end, we were getting the benefits of being outside, and we were hearing the services and the music and not the traffic. Toward the beginning of the summer, before Luke was actually actively involved all the time, I would say it was weighing the other way. So for me, it's about intentionality. And usually if you ask me a question, the answer is going to be it's about intentionality. But I think you can do it. It's just going to take work, and it's going to take technology. And if we have that work, we have the equipment, we have the technology, I think we can make it go above and beyond the traffic sounds. The other thing I will note is that we could, if we want to be even more intentional, play with the sound barriers, so that using natural foliage and natural elements, not something we've done yet. Any other questions, Gary? Well, right. So what they have looked at is there's improvement with saturation variation, and also with shifting toward green-yellow from blue-purple. So more blue-purple, not as good as green-yellow. But as to adding red, like how important is it that I have crotons in my garden and stuff like that, which are yellow-red? I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, I would say think about crotons. Think about crotons. Crotons. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. Last question. It's about 7 o'clock, and I told people we would be done in an hour. Okay. What? You have wrap-up comments. Okay, so we're going to turn it over now to Julie Arnheim for wrap-up comments. Thank you. We'll get back to that.
Greg, thank you so much for your enlightening talk, and I hope everyone in the room, everyone online, and everyone who watches our recording comes and visits our garden, but also takes advantage of the beautiful city parks we have. Look into Grow Pittsburgh, as Greg mentioned, about diversity and helping some of the less popular or less the disadvantaged areas. I know in Homestead, there's Amity Garden right across from Aldi that's always looking for extra hands to help keep that garden going. Tomorrow morning, speaking of city parks, the 1027 Healing Partnership, which came out of the unfortunate incident at Tree of Life in 2018, has partnered with city parks, and we are having a meditative walk here at 9 a.m. And anybody who wants to come is welcome to join us. And our garden is open from Sunday through Thursday, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Weather permitting. We closed early today because of the heat. And we would have closed because of rainstorms, thunderstorms as well. Keep an eye on our social media account, because that's where we will let people know if there's a quick closing. Enjoy our garden as much as you enjoyed Greg's talk. Thank you again, Greg.